Hello, microeconomists. Welcome back to our next episode, possibly our final episode of Micro. We are in Chapter 17, looking at behavioral economics and risk. We talked about rationality earlier and what it means and what it does not mean. It's badly misunderstood in the media. However, there are some real cases where people do behave in a way that's irrational. We learned about risk as well. We saw how economists model risk, and we saw some of the shortcomings of that. Our last section here is going to look at a bunch of things in human behavior that I call them quirks. So interesting results have been found in the psychology and behavioral economics literature. So let's start with talking about patterns. So one issue is that people often see patterns where none exist. If you give people something that's random or is pretty close to random, they'll often try to spot a pattern that isn't there. So one example I give is constellations. There's a whole pseudoscience of astrology based on the stars, and there isn't any actual meaning to astrology. There's no real pattern in astrology, but it has some traction, and some people do take their horoscope and do take astrology seriously. People are especially susceptible to spotting patterns that don't exist when there are small samples. So if you go and take some stats classes, you'll learn about how to test for significance. You'll be able to test for, is this a real pattern, or is this just random variation? This is just randomness. So oftentimes, it's really surprising. I find this out all the time when I look at the data. They're saying it really does look like a convincing pattern. They run a statistical test, and the test says, nope, probably just random noise. So, a number of examples. Let's look at baseball. So, baseball season, if we'll have one, if the coronavirus shutdown ends at some point, they decide things with a 7-game World Series match between two teams. First team to win 4 games is the champion. So sometimes a team is going to win by 4 games to none. That sounds like a very convincing sweep. You'll probably hear sports commentators saying things like, the Yankees really dominated that World Series event and totally crushed the other team. 4 games to none. It turns out, though, that even a convincing victory like 4 games to none could occur through random variation. Let's imagine you have 2 equal teams playing against each other. So let's call them A and B, just to keep things simple. So if they really are equal, that means that it's a 50% chance that Team A wins Game 1, 50% chance that Team B wins Game 1. So how likely is it that Team A wins 4 games in a row? So it'd be winning Game 1 is probably 1/2. Game 2 of the other probably 1/2. So you have half times a half. So a half raised to the 4th power is going to be the probability that Team A wins 4 games in a row. That works out to 1/16. By symmetry, because the teams are equal, then Team B could win 4 games in a row with probability 1/16. So the probability that one team, either Team A or Team B, wins 4 games in a row is going to be 1/16 plus 1/16. That comes out to 1/8. 1/8 is 12.5%. So if you have 2 equal teams playing against each other, there's still a fair chance that someone's going to dominate, win convincingly by 4-0. So a 4-0 sweep doesn't rule out that it could just be randomness. the teams really are equal, just randomness could cause one team to prevail by such a convincing, or apparently convincing, margin. So we see patterns, dominance, when it could just be randomness. There could be no pattern at all. Here's another example. So I play a lot of chess. I wrote an article about the World Chess Championship and doing some stats tests on those results. Back in 1961, we had a match between Botvinnik and Mikhail Tal, and Botvinnik won by a pretty convincing margin. So 13-8, so Botvinnik won 10 games, he lost 5, and he drew 6. So, promoting my own research here again, Wilson in 2013 demonstrated that Botvinnik's victory was not statistically significant. So it's possible that Botvinnik and Tal were both equally good at chess, but some randomness happened to favor Botvinnik in 61, and that could have caused this convincing 13-8 blowout. So looks like a pattern, but does not hold up to scrutiny. People often see patterns that aren't there in small samples. So loosely speaking, you should take a stats class to see this more precisely. A lot of times patterns that appear to be there in small samples are not real. Patterns in large samples, though, are probably more likely to be actual patterns. But again, you need some actual tests to be sure about that. That's very loosely speaking. So people is biased to finding patterns that often aren't there. So a couple of particular patterns people often fall for are called the hot hand fallacy, and also there's the gambler's fallacy. So let's say you have some random sequence of events. So the hot hand fallacy says that if something's happened a lot recently, it's going to happen again. If the sequence, though, really is random, that's not true. So the hot hand fallacy came from this very important paper that got a lot of attention. Gilovich? Not quite sure how to pronounce that. So, famous paper studied the basketball data. So they look at things like, did a player complete a shot, and they complete the next shot after that, the shots following. Oftentimes you'll hear a sports commentator say things, wow, player X is really on fire tonight. He's making one basket after another. Player X is really in the groove tonight, on top of his game. So I think because player X made the last 3 shots in a row, that they're going to be very likely to make the 4th shot afterwards. Well, these authors demonstrate that it's actually not true. So whether the player made the last 3 shots in a row really doesn't predict whether they're going to make the 4th shot in a row. It's really just randomness. So they're seeing a pattern that's not there. Player X is not actually on fire and in the groove. They just had some good luck to hit 3 shots in a row. So that's the hot hand fallacy. So the flip side of that is something called the gambler's fallacy. So that says that when you got this random sequence and something's not happened for a while, then it's due to happen next. So you might hear some sports commentators saying things like, player Y has not gotten a hit in a while. We know he's a great slugger, so he's just due for a hit next time he's at bat. It's not actually true. So there's a lot of randomness there, and whether player Y has struck out the last 4 times in a row doesn't actually tell you anything about what's going to happen in their 5th at bat. So another example, the gambler's fallacy. So a gambler has lost a lot of money at a casino. They know that doesn't always happen. Sometimes they get lucky. It happens half the time they win money. The other time they get unlucky and they lose half the time. 50-50. So if I got unlucky the last 3 times in a row, then I'm due to get lucky next time. So the probability of getting lucky next time is going to be higher than 50%. That is not true. Still 50-50. So people often fall for hot hand fallacy and gambler's fallacy. I guess I mentioned that sports commentators are especially vulnerable to this, but it's not just them. A lot of people see patterns where none exist and try to impose these patterns upon data that really are just random. So that's one quirk of human behavior. People often don't perceive probabilities correctly. Your book mentions some other examples of probabilities being misperceived. They mentioned like a game show where if you do some thinking, you can work out that a certain choice is better than the other one. That thinking, though, is not entirely obvious. So a lot of times in a game show, people would fail to make the right choice. I wouldn't call it irrational. I really call it more an example of bounded rationality. We do want to make the best choice, but our brains are limited. Sometimes our limited brains can't work out these complicated probability and stat stuff easily. Another example your book mentioned that looking at a per mile basis, then flying is a lot safer than driving. Some people, though, are very much afraid of airplanes. I'm not sure I'd call that irrational either, because a lot of people just don't know the data on traffic versus airline fatalities. Do you know off the top of your head the probability of getting into a fatal car accident? I don't. I also don't know what the probability is for airlines. If you don't know what the numbers are and you're just guessing, your guesses could be wrong. So it's not irrationality, it's just people being ignorant. There is actually a literature, let's not get too off track here, but this is some interesting stuff. There's a literature on what's called rational inattention. The idea is that you do want information. Information does help you make better choices. However, gathering information takes time and effort, and you don't want to do that all the time. So it could be the case that it's rational to not get full information. If the effort to get the information is high and the benefit of it's low, then a rational person could say, I'm not going to get full information. I'd rather work with more limited information and just try to make the best judgment from there. So that's patterns. Now we'll look at priming. We actually saw some examples earlier of priming. This is back in chapter 16. So in general, priming means that something that just happened to you recently ends up affecting your choice in something that's unrelated that comes up next. So that's a very broad and general definition. Here are some examples we saw earlier. I talked about happiness surveys back in chapter 16. So we defined utility to be, loosely speaking, the amount of happiness you get from consuming. Now, some papers out there try to measure happiness by taking a survey. They ask you, like on a scale from 0 to 10, how happy are you with your life overall? Stuff like that. I said those surveys are basically nonsense, and the reason is that priming seems to have a lot to do with it. So one example I mentioned was that Gallup has a tracking poll. So Gallup's a polling organization. They ask questions about politics and life and economics, other stuff. So one question they ask people regularly is, how happy are you feeling with your life overall? So one day, Gallup altered their survey. They used to have a question about politicians, and then they ask about happiness. They dropped that question, and people's happiness suddenly increased. What was going on there? It's priming. If you ask about politicians, they get unhappy, and that affects their overall life happiness because they are unhappy with politicians. If you drop the question about politicians, though, then suddenly I'm happier about life, and my happiness goes up. This is not actually about life happiness, though. What they're really telling you about is how happy am I feeling right now. So life satisfaction, which we're trying to measure, is not being captured. Another experiment found something similar. So half the people in the experiment did the survey about happiness, and they had to make some copies first on a copy machine. The other half of the people in the experiment did the same thing, but they were lucky enough to find a dime in the copy machine that had been planted by the experimenter. So a dime shouldn't matter a whole lot for your overall lifetime happiness. When you graduate, you'll be making money that's probably tens of thousands a year. So an extra 10 cents in your lifetime, that's not going to matter a ton. However, lifetime happiness soared when people found another 10 cents. They're not really telling you lifetime happiness. They're telling you that they got some extra happiness from this unexpected joy. So priming, this finding of 10 cents, influenced their next choice about their happiness survey. So people often let recent events influence them on things that are unrelated. So that's another quirk of human behavior. Another issue is what's called status quo bias. So what this says is that there's a lot of inertia in people's behavior. So some big examples of it. There's been a lot of work on retirement programs. So it turns out that if you're trying to get people to sign up to retirement accounts and retirement incentives, it matters a really big deal if that program is opt-in or if it's opt-out. If the program is opt-in, then the default is to not do it. Default is no program. People tend to stick with that default. So if they have to opt into it, they're probably not going to do it. If you make the program opt out, so that program's a default, you're going to be automatically saving money unless you state otherwise. People tend to stick with that too. So the program becomes opt out, then people participate in these programs at a much higher rate. Now, a choice to go into or out of a program to retirement is usually not that hard. Just got to fill out usually like a one-page form at the HR office. So that small choice of filling out a form could make a big difference down the road for how much money you have when you retire. So it's really not very logical that that one-page form is a big obstacle to people's choices about retirement. It's really just a heavy inertia, a bias towards staying to the status quo. So one program out there that's designed to circumvent this is, first of all, make the programs opt-out rather than opt-in, so saving is the default. Another program is the Save More Tomorrow program. The economist who proposed this last name is Benartzi. He has done a lot of famous research on behavioral economics. His idea is that when you're starting a new job, you can commit in advance that when I get a raise, I'm going to save X percent of that. Maybe I'll save 20% of any future raises I get. His idea is that it makes saving the default. So if I got a raise and I don't have this program, then let's just go straight to my bank account. My default is I spend the money in my bank account. I don't save the money in my bank account. So as a result, the status quo bias, people don't save when they get raises. If you make saving the default though, then people can save more and tend to save a lot more in this program than they would have otherwise. And also the way that people can, even when they're early in their career and not earning very much, they can still make a plan to save more in the future and stick to it. This is part of a broad range of ideas. They call them nudges after a popular book. The idea is that we still have to preserve choice. You can still opt out of the program. You don't have to do Save More Tomorrow. You can still choose not to retire. However, we design the programs in a way that make good behavior the default. It'll make it easy for people to do things that they think they probably should be doing. So people probably should save money for retirement. That seems like a good idea. Let's make that easy for them. Let's make that the default, so they stick to the default, they stick to a good plan. And once again, we can go promote our own research here. To be clear though, I'm not a big name in micro or in behavioral. If you ask other people, if you heard about the important work of Wilson, they'll say, what? My work is not super famous. I'm not super famous either. So that being said, I can shed some light on what's going on here. So I mentioned my model earlier where it takes effort to make decisions. It takes effort to figure out what you want. People don't like using all that effort. The example I used was that you want to think about precisely how many grains of rice should I have with my meal. That's a lot of work. So you might save on effort at the risk of making choices that are less than perfect. So if I get a measuring cup out and measure a certain amount of rice, I'm off by a few grains, I'm not going to worry about that, even if technically it makes me irrational. So because making choices takes effort and people don't like effort, you might make some shortcuts, some heuristics to save you effort. So one shortcut you can take is that I'm just going to stick to the default, whatever that is. If the default is opt-in to retirement, I'm going to stick to no program. If it's opt-out though, and by default I'm going to be in the program, I'll stay in that program. That way I don't have to think about what I'm going to do each time. I save effort on decisions. There are lots of ways that you guys too try to save effort. Back before the shutdown, when we had face-to-face classes, you probably sat in the same spot every class, or pretty close to it. Why is that? Well, you don't want to think about where should I sit every single class. It makes a lot more sense to have a shortcut where you think about on day one, they go back to the same seat every single time. Save you some effort, makes life easier by having these habits. Habits are also consistent with the Wilson paper written in 2018. Or I should say, more precisely, published in 2018. So if people do have a status quo bias, you can try to explain that by saying that it takes effort to make decisions. The shortcut is to stick to the status quo. All right, our next quirk of human behavior is impatience. In the interest of time, we'll stop here. We'll talk about that in our next episode.